Mr. Vass, Mr. Korczak, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. Good morning. Welcome to the opening session of the TATRA Summit 2015. For those of you who came all the way to Bratislava to hear Peter Spiegel speak, I'm sorry to let you down. Today I'm stepping into his enormous shoes. My name is Henry Foy. I'm the Central Europe correspondent for the Financial Times, based in Warsaw in Poland, just a short jump for me across the border. I had the honor this morning of moderating this opening panel, State of the Union, Europe at a Crossroads. As you'll see in your agenda, there is a question mark at the end of that title. As a journalist at a quality newspaper, I've been taught that if there's a question mark at the end of the headline, it's probably not true. However, in this case, the question mark is a very powerful piece of punctuation. And to debate whether or not it should be there or not, and if so, what that means, we have a very distinguished panel this morning. So I'd like to invite, first up, Jörg Asmussen, the Permanent State Secretary at the Federal Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs in Germany. Thank you, Jörg. Yeah, perfect. We'll do alphabetical, that's easier. Joining him is Yves Bertoncini. He's the director of the Jacques Delors Institute in Paris. Also joining us is Sandro Gozzi. He's the Secretary of State for European Affairs in the Office of the Prime Minister in Italy. And last but by no means least, Mr. Charles Tannock. He's a Member of Parliament from the UK in the European Parliament in Brussels. I spent the whole of October looking at ballot boxes in Greece, Belarus, and Poland, covering three very different elections, all with clear winners, one never in doubt. All three of those elections touched on some of the issues that we'll be discussing today. Mr. Tsipras, Mr. Lukashenko, and Mr. Kaczynski all pose very different issues for Europe. Greece, of course, needs no introduction. For years, it had been a byword for economic fragility, perhaps, in the EU financial system, in governance, and in the potential of further integration. But Greece is also, of course, a major player in the migrant crisis, currently dominating the front pages of newspapers all across Europe, a crisis that's seen more than 500,000 people arrive in Europe already this year, and no sign of those numbers decreasing. In Belarus, Mr. Lukashenko, of course, represents not just a question of eastern expansion, but also the crisis on the EU's eastern border, of a resurgent Russia challenging the security of neighboring states, and a war in Ukraine that the Belarusian president used as a tool. And finally, in Poland, a critical election saw the landslide victory for a party that has had difficult relations with the EU in the past and has vowed to push back against EU regulations on both climate change and migration. And for many, represents a rising sense of national interest in this part of the world vis-à-vis the desire to please Brussels. It is indeed a heady mix, and one that we will talk about for the next hour and 20 minutes or so. We welcome all of your questions from the audience. There's a very clever app that you can send me questions through the app, and also there's a poll on there too. Please do engage with the technology. If it fails, I'm sure we will rely on microphones or not shouting. Jörg, I'm going to come to you first. Journalists, analysts, conferences such as these, they love the word crisis. They love to talk about things not going as well, or is Europe facing challenges that perhaps it never really thought it would ever have to face?
I mean, Europe has been at the crossroads so often in the last decade, so I'm very much convinced that also this time we will manage to deal with it. Mm-hmm. Indeed, it's a relatively unique situation. I mean, the refugee issue overshadows everything. We have more people on the move, global, 60 million people. Mm-hmm. Many of them come to Europe. Again, many of them who come to Europe come to Germany. I think it poses a significant challenge to us, but I'm also deeply convinced that we are able to deal with this. If we are able to deal with it as Germany, but not on our own. But my overall sense is we can do it. It's a task for a generation. It's nothing that we can solve in 6, 9, or 12 months. We have to be honest. It will take time, for example, to integrate those who come to us in our labor markets. But I'm convinced we will manage this task. And I'm also convinced that it will. And my plea would be that even if we have this refugee crisis now, that we do not forget what was on our plate before that topic arrived. I mean, climate change will not go away. The economic and monetary union that Ivan talked about will not go away. The total change of our economy and our labor markets due to digitalization, makers in their decision-making process, but also media, only focus on one topic. So let's deal with the refugee crisis. We can do this, but not forget at the same time what else.
A problem here, not just in the scale of the challenges, but how many there are, and Europe does struggle to deal with things simultaneously. I mean, is that a bigger challenge than maybe the scale of them individually?
Well, I think that the priority of the media are different from the priority of politics. It is clear that now
I'm sure that's a good thing.
are more aware about this and more brave about this, as very often politics is not brave enough and aware enough of the fact that you cannot follow the media. But in general, it should be the media to follow politics. What do I mean? I mean that I agree with what has been said. It is clear that there are many issues at stake, and not only migration. There is migration, but there is a governance of the Eurozone which is clearly flawed, and that we should address. Now, the question is, the golden thread is much bigger, and in my view justifies more Europe, as Jorgen said. I mean, there is one word that we never pronounce, this word, which is demography. And this is true for migration, and this is true also for the fiscal policy that we have to develop around the Eurozone. We can divide ourselves, Democrats, not so Democrats. All these kind of species are mushrooming in Europe. But we cannot divide ourselves about the issue of demography, neither within Europe, nor in our relations with a big country like Africa. And the issue of migration is mainly linked to this. Now it is agreed policy. We Italians, since the day number one of the Renzi government, we have been saying what now is common knowledge. It is not enough to have common knowledge, common wisdom. Now we need to implement what has been agreed. Because one thing is to arrive very late, not too late, to a common wisdom, which is the agreement on migration. Another thing is if it is take too much time to implement it. Of course. So Europe is giving answer, very late, but is giving answer. But there is this issue. Around this, we have to organize our policy, because demography justifies the value added of Europe, of more Europe. Otherwise, it is difficult sometimes to justify why a stronger European action or a wider European dimension are needed.
Thank you. Charles, someone that sits in Brussels, sits in the Parliament, do you think there is that common sense of needing to do something, or do you think that Brussels is as divided as ever?
Well, as a parliamentarian who has to knock on doors in my home constituency of the United Kingdom, there is a crisis. And there's also a crisis in terms of some of the elite projects like the Eurozone, which have clearly not been fully thought through. And I think there's a loss of confidence at popular level, sort of almost like a European demos now in the political classes to sort these problems out. And we seem to be stumbling from one crisis to the next. You know, is it Brexit? Now it's the migration. It's defense of the external borders. Have they been properly thought through? And so on. And of course, there's both a wider Europe crisis going on in terms of Russia, Ukraine, stability in the Balkans, an election of an increasingly authoritarian government crisis, in as much as that we face, you know, a situation in the next 18 months or so in which my country could leave the European Union. And if we leave, that it will be a very major destabilizing signal to the whole project, which could rapidly unravel. I mean, already we see in Holland a million signatures going to the national parliament demanding a referendum on the free trade agreement with the Ukraine, which is bizarre. Now, if we see a Brexit, there will be rapidly a demand for a Holland exit as well, and so on. So I think we can't just sort of brush over this as just yet another crisis in which the solution is more Europe, which is what we hear from Mr. Juncker and others. The demographic problem in Italy is very, very acute. I come from a country where there is no demographic problem. We have the problem of our population expanding so rapidly. It's predicted it will hit 70 million people in the next 20 years, from currently 63. When I was a young man, it was 56. It's now 63, hitting 70, largely driven by immigration. And where some of the political classes, particularly less so in Eastern Europe because you don't have the same experiences, is this concept now that social cohesion has gone to the top of the political agenda. So the economic arguments about demographics needing more migration are no longer having the same pull factor with the ordinary voter they may have had in the past when the numbers were much smaller. When you have a situation in Britain where 600,000 people have settled, 1% of the population has settled in the last year alone, this is a very major issue. We can't just brush it aside, and we need to find reasonable solutions. But certainly, I think my country was right in predicting the risks of the euro as a concept, as a single currency. We wish it well as a project. Now we want to make it clear we don't want to be part of it. But we also were not part of the asylum and immigration common policy either, because we also thought this could cause problems in the future. We were very skeptical about Schengen working, although very well intentioned all these projects were. So I think there is a really serious project now, and I think in Brussels, in the Parliament, you get a big split. You get a split between the right wing and the far left, who are very increasingly virulently Eurosceptic. You've got Madame Le Pen standing up saying she wants France to leave the European Union. She's running at 25% in the polls. She may even get through the second round of the presidential election. This has never been witnessed in my lifetime as an MEP. I've been around for 16 years in the European Parliament. And just to sort of paper over the cracks and to say more Europe is the solution, we will somehow weather the storm and it'll all be okay, there are still sunlit uplands up there just over the horizon, is an item of faith. I am very, very concerned about these challenges. The whole issue of Britain leaving the European Union has to be one of the biggest existential challenges to the whole project.
There are lots of topics there, and I know that lots of gentlemen, but Eve, let's come to you first. Is there an issue here that Europe's it's losing the trust of the citizens now? It's not just the politicians who are bickering, the citizens are starting to question the project. Is that a more fundamental issue here that puts Europe at this crossroads?
Good morning. Yes, you're perfectly right. It's a Europe facing crisis, provoking, yes, disappointments, rejections, not only Euroscepticism, but also Europhobia, and it's a different story. Euroscepticism is, well, you don't like that, but you stay. Europhobia is you hate Europe that much that you go out. It's true for Euro membership, Schengen, and the pressure today, and of course the possible Brexit. I think it's not a love it or leave it dilemma. And I think for the citizens you have mentioned, there are very contradictory reactions. If I take one example, the euro area crisis, there were tensions around the dialectic, more solidarity from the European Union, because it was needed. It was not planned, but it was needed, so bailout. And in compensation, more control. So Europe has lost Slovakia, but I could have maybe had Germany or Finland. It was too much solidarity. So for German citizens, too much solidarity. But of course, for Greek people, for Portuguese people, it was too much control, too much austerity. So Euroscepticism, three types of Euroscepticism. But no Europhobia, because the Greeks wanted to remain part of the EU and the European Union, the Eurozone, the Schengen area as well. So we will see what will happen as regards the refugee crisis and the Schengen area. But it's the same dialectic. Solidarity needed, but also more control needed. It's not only a crisis of solidarity, it's also a crisis of confidence. And not only confidence for the citizens, but confidence between the member states. But what I see today is that the spinal cord of the European integration has been put under pressure. Yes, Euro and Schengen, it's a spinal cord. But still, it resists. So it's what I call Euroscoliosis. It's not Eurosclerosis. Eurosclerosis was when nothing happened. Now, a lot happens. And of course, it's a bit strange. Solutions, it's too little, too late. But still, it resists. And what we have witnessed up until now, it's further progress of the European integration. And on last point, last example, I'm happy to say this in Slovakia, it has forced citizens and member states to be aware of the fact that being a member of a union means rights and duties. So for example, what is at stake today in a refugee crisis is, of course, there are duties and rights. Duties, it's also to control efficiently external borders, because it's our borders. But duties is also sharing relocation mechanism, part of the solidarity aspect. And I think in Slovakia it's 802 people. So what Slovakia will have to consider, yes, sometimes you don't like it, and the rights to be part of a free movement area and the Schengen area. So that's what is at stake today. My last point is to say in this first statement that what is striking is that these crises have been inward-looking crises. Inward-looking crises. I mean, we are all looking at each other. We are not very confident vis-à-vis each other, between citizens, between member states. And we are focusing on differences between Visegrad Group countries and Germany, or Greece and Finland. But at the same time, there were external crises. And what we need is more outward-looking Daesh and terrorism, climate change, many global challenges, vis-à-vis which, you mentioned the Crossroads, people have to know whether the EU is a threat, because on the previous crisis it was seen as a threat, because too much solidarity, too much control, or on the contrary, an answer to these threats. But for this shift to happen, and I think it's underway, there is a need to focus more on external crises, vis-à-vis which a common answer is needed, and maybe then more united actions than the division we have seen in the last 4 years.
More crisis is good, you think? Sandra, I noticed you were sort of becoming piqued by a few comments in Charles's opening statement. I mean, this idea of more Europe to tackle the crisis, it seems to a lay viewer perhaps that the crisis is exposing the gaps between European countries. How do you then think that they should be pulled back together by more crisis? I mean, could you sort of elegate that a bit?
Well, I mean, of course, demography is another British exception, because demography in the rest of the continent is the demography I was talking about. Of course, we have to listen to the British demography and exception, but we have to think to the future of the continent. The future of the continent says that demography is on the negative side, and then by 2050, UN report, European Commission report, the enlarged union, which will be of 32, 33, 35 countries, we'll need 40 million workers more. That's what we have to think about. Of course, I mean, as a politician, you would never say this in the daily debate, but at least we have to think this and to act according to this, because that's the reality we are facing. The rest, so it's not an act of faith, it is an act of political pragmatism. What we have paid in the last years, it is the non-Europe in migration and asylum, not the migratory and asylum common policy, which were non-existing. We have paid the price of pretending that we could deal with the phenomenon which is by its nature transnational, and that because of crisis around the world, as if say, is increasing. Well, if you think that you can rule and govern a transnational phenomenon with national or even worse, nationalistic policies, you are fooling yourselves and you are fooling your people. And it can work in the very short term, but it certainly won't pay back in the medium term. And this is the heaven for the extremism, the heaven for populism, because what the citizens do expect from us is concrete answer to solve concrete problems. And the issue of migration, it is a concrete problem. It affects social cohesion, it affects the budget, it affects the lack of workers, it affects security. Now, we don't want, and we hope we won't pay the cost of slow Europe in implementing this. And of course, being it transnational, it is clear that it must push us to look beyond our belly bottom and to look beyond our common borders, which are not, by the way, ruled as common border, another problem in the problem. And we have to look to Turkey, and we have to look to Syria, and we have to look to Libya. I mean, also, also Libya, I mean, it has been, many mistakes have been made on Libya, because making a war without doing to do after the war, it has been a major mistake. And now, today, we are paying we are paying another cost, and those who thought that it was only an Italian cost have been fooled again, because it is clear that this issue requires a stronger European action. So I mean, it is not a question. I don't like the rhetoric of Europe has been always has always got stronger and bigger and more convincing crisis through crisis, because I think that this is self-complacency, and that it doesn't work. It doesn't work today. But it is clear that we have to be very clear on how we manage the common issues. And the fact that the UK is not in Schengen hasn't helped at all the issue of Calais. Because you got the Calais crisis, and you got the crisis at the border between France and UK, even if UK is not in Schengen. So, I mean, you see the point. Also on this, I want to be very clear, because also you invited us to be very clear. We say in Italy, when you have to make an hard choice, that you are on a tower, and you have to choose what you want to throw out of the tower. Well, for me, I'm positive. I want to throw out of the tower Dublin, because it is obsolete, because it has proven ineffective, because it has proved totally inadequate, because it was conceived in another historical era, and I want to keep Schengen. But not because of an act of faith, but because Schengen is freedom for Europeans. Schengen is the biggest gift that Europe has given to Europeans. And I think that we shouldn't put at stake, but we should take the countermeasures, common border, security on our border, more concrete and effective European action with the country of origin and transit, things we will discuss in La Valletta and we will discuss after La Valletta, but on which we have to be much more effective.
This is the Dublin Agreement. This isn't an advocacy for getting rid of Ireland from the Eurozone. I mean, there is a separate debate on migration, but I do think we should focus on it here as well. I mean, Germany's position has been one of great interest to, I think, a lot of people in Europe. Normally, with these crises, Germany takes a really strong role. It leads the way. A lot of smaller countries says, well, you know, Germany's on it, it's fine, we're going to stand behind. But we've seen a certain amount of insecurity within Germany itself. Has the migrant crisis been almost a watershed crisis for Germany in terms of the EU project and its leadership?
Yeah, we got used to the situation that what you just pointed out, that people like to know our views. This is a bit what I'm not so much in favor of. I mean, we need joint European decision-making and solutions. What is different in the current situation, let's call it refugee crisis openly, is of course that compared to other crises that we have seen in recent time, may it be the one in Syria or the one in Ukraine or even the crisis that affected some Euro area countries, this crisis is very tangible and visible to Joe Sixpack, to ordinary citizens. Yeah, the Greek debate was more or less confined to politicians, technocrats, bankers, and media. Yeah, you discussed this in the center of Berlin in a kind of spaceship in which we all live and in which we earn our money. The refugee crisis is a different one. It's visible and tangible throughout the country. Yeah, we receive currently around 10,000 people per day. Yeah, that means every morning you need to provide 10,000 additional breakfasts. So it's not a question of money for us. It's simply a question how you deal with the logistics given the sheer size of people that arrive. Yeah, Chancellor Merkel has spoken, we expect this year roughly around 1 million people to come. And this is more than 1% of our population. And these people are distributed in the country, and you can see them everywhere. I mean, my parents live in a small town in the northwest of Germany, and there were certain times, it's close to the Danish border, when Denmark had closed its borders, there were hundreds of people just living in this tiny train station of that town. Yeah. So this makes it very different and increases the pressure on politicians when they go down to their constituency. It brings a lot of more heat in this debate. But what I recognize in the country is that up to now we see an unprecedented wave of people willing to help. Yeah, people showing up in this kind of refugee camps and provide their service, bring clothes, bring food, bring money, whatsoever. I've never seen such a wave before, but at the same time, one has to be honest, there is an attack on a refugee camp nearly every night. This is also part of the reality that we see in my country. So it's a new situation, but as I said, I think we can deal with this if we manage to set the right course, but we are not able to deal with it on our own. Sandro has rightly said, effective border control does not take place between France and Germany. This is not what is needed. Yeah, we have European borders, so our borders are the borders of the EU.
Charles, to play devil's advocate, surely the migration crisis does put the onus on more Europe, on saying, let's break down these national barriers, let's have a much more concerted effort to control borders as a whole, let's try to integrate strategies in terms of rehousing people. I mean, even surely you see that argument.
I see the argument. I don't actually agree with it, to be honest, because, again, I come from a country which stayed out of the common asylum and immigration problem. We believe that, when you have a situation where we have today, the question I have to ask my German colleague here is, you've given the signal from your government that Germany has an open door policy for virtually any Syrian, irrespective of who they are, where they come from within Syria, or whether or not they're genuinely Syrian, because you get people claiming now to be Syrian who aren't even Syrians because they've ripped up their passports. So the numbers are unlimited. There's some 80 million people living in conflict or zones which might be classified in which the states could be persecuting their citizens, and therefore they would fall under the 51 Geneva Convention. We in Europe have tried to maintain the kind of international moral high ground by maintaining this approach of saying that all refugees can come across the whole world, including neighboring countries which don't take them. I mean, how many Syrians have been taken by the Gulf Cooperation Council countries? They share a common language, culture, and religion, but they're taking virtually none at all. And yet they're all heading towards Europe. Understandable. We have a very growing economies, a demographic shrinking problem. We have a generous social security system. But the numbers are unlimited. 1 million this year. What happens if there's another million or two next year and the following year? My worry is that this is going to be a gift to the far right, a gift to Eurosceptics or Europhobics, as you call them. In Britain, a Eurosceptic is somebody who wants to leave the European Union, by the way. You call it a phobic. And I don't see an end to this, how you can easily manage it, I'm afraid, under the existing arrangements that we have with, Schengen, full adherence and a liberal interpretation to the 51 Convention, and, conflict zones all over the place, and increasing problems in Nigeria, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and so on. I mean, people are coming from Pakistan, people are coming from Nigeria, they're coming from Eritrea, they're coming from Afghanistan, even though we have we lost thousands of our soldiers trying to re-establish peace and security in Afghanistan. I think that unless we send a very strong signal that we cannot have an open door policy, that this is a global issue that needs to be addressed at a global level, Europe will be under enormous pressure. And I fear for the rise of the far right, victories for parties like Le Pen's, and you have the Lega in Italy. You see some of the things they say in the European Parliament. You have the Swedish Democrats. All sorts of Eurosceptics and far rightists getting together and saying enough is enough, and we need to start to have fortress national borders, not let alone the external border. And I worry for the consequences. And I know it's very well intentioned, the German attitude, the chancellors, but as Mr. Orban said, from next door Hungary, we don't want to be have a multicultural agenda imposed on us from Brussels. These are very delicate sovereign issues to nation member states. I'm not sure whether you can impose quotas on countries which are unwilling to take them. If they want to take them, that's fine. But the other problem, of course, is how many of these individuals are genuine refugees? How many of them are economic migrants? That question has not been fully addressed either.
Sure, I'm sure the next panel will deal with that. Yves, Charles mentions Mr. Orban. I mean, that's a good point. I mean, has Euroscepticism, Europhobia become sort of the norm now? This is sort of what Europe will have to deal with. We have leaders standing up and saying these things in the European Parliament, openly criticizing the way things work. Is that a shift that maybe the EU didn't think would happen 10 years ago? It's sort of, these people are here to stay.
Yes, of course, Euroscepticism is growing. Europhobia, which I distinguish, is growing as well. They are not that powerful. If you look at the European Parliament, of course, they are more powerful than before. They are not powerful at the European Council as well. The problem is the pressure they put on mainstream parties.
Yes.
And in this, of course, they have an influence. Sometimes, and it's true in the UK, they can set the agenda. Mr. Farage had hardly ever one seat in the House of Commons. Now only one, but he has set the agenda. So of course they have an influence. It's partly linked to the European crisis, but I want to stress that it's also linked to domestic problems. And you have mentioned Marine Le Pen twice. I'm sorry to say that Marine Le Pen's progression is mainly due to domestic reasons. The way France has been badly managed for years and years, and France is facing a social crisis, an identity crisis, as well as a political crisis. So Marine Le Pen is a product of this, and it's not the product mainly of Europhobia in France, even if it's part of her doctrine, of course. So I've mentioned the identity crisis, and to answer your question, is it to last? I mean, these Euroscepticism or Europhobia? It will all depend on the elite's reaction, the mainstream party's reaction. And I will take the example of the refugee crisis. Of course, this creates tensions, especially in countries in economic and social crisis, but not only, because it's also an identity challenge. And in this, I share your view, it's an identity challenge. But the key factor is the position of the elites. And I will take the example of Mrs. Merkel. What did she say? She said, of course, it's a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge, as important as the reunification one. But we are strong. We are Germany. It's our duty to welcome the refugees. The refugees are not threats, they are victims. And I think this is a crossroad as well, whether you consider they are victims or threats. Of course, she never said we will welcome all economic immigrants from abroad, and she said very clearly we need to welcome refugees. But I think the key question for the elites and for mainstream parties is this one. Are we threatened? And again, I come back to Slovakia. Are we threatened? Are we threatened as Slovaks by 802 people coming from Syria? 802. This is key. And if the elites, and if the Prime Minister, Mr. Fico, is thinking that, yes, Slovakia is threatened by 802 people coming from Syria, it's a problem, yes, of course. And if it's the case, if the mainstream parties goes on adopting the vision of the world of the Eurosceptics and Europhobes, yes, of course, it can last. If, again, my last point on this, if they look at the world a bit more, what they will see is that Europe is shrinking. We are 7% of the world population. Soon 6%, and I come to Sandro's point on demography. We are united in diversity. At the moment, we are united in perplexity. But shouldn't we be more united in adversity in this world, where, again, Mr. Putin, Daesh, the instability of our neighborhood, which is unprecedented. There are wars everywhere around us, not to mention China, the BRICS, climate change, all these challenges. Are our leaders able to produce a narrative, not saying there's no problem between us? Of course, there are problems, there are differences, there are clashes. But the main agenda for Europeans, now that they are united again, is to look at the world and to see if, facing this common challenge, more common solutions are needed. My answer is yes, but I mean, the main answers to be given are from politicians.
You're going to give you an opportunity to respond to Charles, but also in your answer, if you could touch on that point. I mean, how do leaders, mainstream parties, people like Mrs. Merkel, but others, use these crises to their advantage, to sort of continue to advance the European project rather than admit defeat?
Yes, I think I want to clarify a bit what is our stance on the issue. I mean, first, and this is totally out of any question, we will defend the free movement of people inside the EU. This is one of the greatest achievements that we have in this continent. Yeah. that you can freely move, work, study, whatsoever. And that if you come from France or from Sweden to Germany, if you come from Poland or Slovakia, that you are not considered as a foreigner, but as an EU citizen. This is a thing that we will always defend as German government. Then when it comes to people from so-called third countries, non-EU member states, this is also relatively clear. Our legal provisions all say they can come given the needs of our labor market. And then it trickles down to all the instruments, you know, the EU blue card or whatsoever. But this is driven by the need from our labor market. And then there is one exception. This is the right for political asylum. Yeah, this is laid down in our constitution, given our history. So if there's a war in your country, if you're personally prosecuted due to your religious belief, to your gender, whatsoever, you can claim political asylum in Germany. It's a constitutional right that we have. Mm-hmm. And this is currently happening. And in the constitution, there is no limit. So this is why the Chancellor acted as she did. So we welcome these people if they are political asylum seekers. There's a different group that often, let's say, comes from the Western Balkan countries. They come for economic reasons. I can understand this if you are 25 and live in Kosovo or in Macedonia, that you say, I have a better perspective somewhere else. But you're not in a position to claim political asylum. So we must be honest to this kind of people. We understand your reasoning, but not all of you can stay. Yeah, we have improved the legal labor migration from the Western Balkans, but this is not a question of political asylum. What political leaders need to do now is to support action, I think, on 3 different layers. The first one is the domestic one, and here we have to distinguish between short-term and medium-term. In the short term, we must simply make sure that we have humane conditions for those who come, given that the winter is in front of us, meaning bringing the people out of tents, provides schools, food, medical treatment, whatsoever. The longer-term issue is more complex, to integrate people into the labor market, because this only will be a success story for those who come as well as for the aging societies that accept them, if we manage to integrate these people into the labor market. And this has first to do with learning the language, second, with professional training and qualification, and third, integration is not voluntary. You also have to accept the values of a democratic society, meaning that men and women have the same rights, that religious or sexual orientations are part of your private life. This has to be accepted. So this is the domestic level. The second level on which we need to act is the European one. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have been talking about a common European asylum policy. It's very much about effective border control at the borders of the EU. These are our common borders. And it's also about a fair distribution, or call it reallocation, of refugees. That is also part of it. And the third part is the European and the international level. That is, we have to deal with the root causes. Why do these people move? Mm. Yeah. And one key point here is to end the war in Syria. We all know this will not take place in 6, 9, or 12 months. But let's put all European and international efforts behind these efforts to stop the reasons why people have to leave their country. So this is what I think is up to the political leaders to act at the domestic level, the European level, and the international level.
I'm keen to move a little bit off the migrant topic so we don't have nothing to talk about later in the day. So, Sandra, to segue, I mean, the migration crisis sort of, if you like, exposed the fault lines, perhaps, between Western Europe and the French and German consensus, if you like, and Central and Eastern Europe, this part of the world. There was a lot of rhetoric. There was, in the end, veto attempts. I mean, is there a risk that too fast integration, too much Europe, risks forcing that divide wider and Brussels losing Central and Eastern Europe? We already see some of the rhetoric coming out of leaders such as Mr. Orban, Mr. Fico, Mr. Kaczynski. I mean, how do we make sure that these countries come along with us? And surely it's their right to determine how fast or slow integration goes.
Difficult question.
That
very
was given
difficult
to you,
question.
Sandro.
But I try to be as clear as possible, as frank as possible. Yves said one thing that is, in my view, at the heart of the debate and the heart of the problem, which is mutual trust.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that our continent, our union has lost mutual trust. We don't trust each other. I don't believe that this is this has been caused initially by the migratory crisis. I think that initially has been caused by the way we handled or we didn't handle the euro crisis, because we have turned our relations into a creditor and debtor relations, and that is awful for the mutual trust and awful for what we want to build up together. And we should draw a lesson from that. But the reality is that we have lost mutual trust. The other that we do not have, on one hand, we have lost mutual trust. On the other hand, probably we haven't been very effective in forging a sort of common political culture about the union.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And from this point of view, another word which has been mentioned by basically all the co-panelists has been solidarity and cohesion. To me, it is very clear. Solidarity is not a one-way street work. It doesn't work only when, as a net contributor in Italy, I have to give 20 billion euro per year to the EU budget, and I get back a little bit more than 10 billion euro. And I understand that for other countries, that kind of solidarity is very good. That's the arithmetic, no? Mathematics. And then you forget that the solidarity is a pillar on the treaty that we have negotiated, that we have adopted, we have ratified in our parliament, we have ratified through referendum, also on other policies.
Mm.
We were talking about migration, but can be also on civil protection, can be on social cohesion, can be on financial stability. I mean, all these situations require solidarity, and I do believe that that has been a major problem in the, I hope not permanent, and I hope not strengthening West and Central Eastern Europe divide. But in my view, some of our friends from Central and Eastern Europe have lost a big occasion. I've lost a big occasion because in terms of quantity, what was required was very low. In terms of political gesture, would have meant a lot. The other issue is it is perfectly useless that we negotiate treaty by treaty and we spend hours and hours of negotiation saying that asylum and migration policy must shift from unanimity to qualified majority voting. We have been negotiating that. We have been very pushy all to foresee that under the Lisbon Treaty, asylum and migration could be decided by majority. It is not